Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on aggregate demand, aggregate supply, policy, and Keynesian thinking. We're going to explore the fascinating world of macroeconomic fluctuations, take a closer look at various policy responses, and dive into some key Keynesian ideas that have shaped economic thought. I'm excited to guide you through these concepts and show how they all connect in the bigger picture of our economy. Let's get started. Here we focus on why the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is so important. At its core, this model helps us understand how changes in overall output, unemployment, and inflation occur in an economy. It provides a clear framework to see how different factors interact and influence these key economic indicators. Additionally, the model is incredibly useful for illustrating the effects of various policies during different economic conditions. Whether it's a recession, a boom, or when the economy faces supply shocks. Essentially, it's a central tool for analyzing and responding to economic fluctuations. Here we have a line chart that illustrates the concept of macroeconomic equilibrium by showing the relationship between aggregate demand and aggregate supply across different levels of real GDP. On the horizontal axis, we measure real GDP, which reflects the total output of the economy, while the vertical axis represents the price level. Notice how the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, indicating that as the price level decreases, the quantity of goods and services demanded increases. On the other hand, the aggregate supply curve slopes upward, showing that as prices rise, producers are willing to supply more. The point where these two curves intersect represents the macroeconomic equilibrium. At this level, the quantity of goods and services demanded matches the quantity supplied, balancing the overall economy. This equilibrium is crucial because it reflects a stable environment where output and prices are balanced, which is essential for sustainable economic growth. Understanding where this intersection occurs helps policymakers and economists gauge the current economic conditions and make informed decisions. Here we focus on what aggregate demand means. Simply put, aggregate demand is the total amount of spending on goods and services produced within a country, measured across different price levels. This spending comes from different parts of the economy: households buying everyday items, businesses investing in equipment, the government funding public services, and even foreign buyers purchasing exports. Understanding this total demand helps us see how various sectors contribute to overall economic activity. It's a key concept for analyzing economic health and guiding policy decisions. Now, let's take a closer look at the main components of aggregate demand. First, we have consumption, which represents household spending on goods and services. This is actually the largest component and drives much of the overall demand in the economy. Next is investment, which includes business spending on capital goods like equipment and also residential construction. Investment is crucial because it impacts the economy's future productive capacity. Then, we have government purchases, covering all government expenditures on goods and services. This directly influences demand by injecting money into the economy. Finally, net exports, which is calculated as exports minus imports. Changes here reflect how much demand is coming from abroad compared to domestic consumption. Together, these components give us a complete picture of what drives aggregate demand. Here we explore why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward by looking at three key effects. First, the wealth effect. When price levels fall, the real value of money increases, so consumers feel wealthier. This boost in perceived wealth encourages them to spend more. Next is the interest rate effect. Lower prices tend to reduce interest rates, which makes borrowing cheaper. As a result, businesses and consumers are more likely to invest and spend. Finally, the foreign trade effect. When domestic prices drop, exports become more competitive abroad, increasing demand from other countries. At the same time, cheaper domestic prices reduce imports. Together, these effects combine to raise total demand as prices decline. Here, we're looking at the key factors that cause aggregate demand to shift either to the right or to the left. On the left side, we see a rightward shift of aggregate demand, which happens when overall spending in the economy increases. This can be driven by higher consumer confidence, meaning people feel optimistic and are more willing to spend. It also includes more business investment, greater government spending, lower taxes that leave consumers with more disposable income, and reduced interest rates that make borrowing cheaper. Favorable exchange rates and rising foreign incomes also contribute by boosting demand for exports. All these factors together lead to an expansion in economic activity. On the right side, a leftward shift occurs when aggregate demand decreases. This happens when spending falls due to lower consumer confidence or reduced business investment. Higher taxes and increased interest rates make it more expensive to borrow and spend, while unfavorable exchange rates and declining foreign income reduce demand for goods and services from abroad. Additionally, cutbacks in government spending contribute to this contraction. As a result, economic activity slows down. Understanding these shifts helps explain how different economic policies and external conditions impact overall demand in the economy. Now let's talk about what aggregate supply actually means. Essentially, aggregate supply represents the total amount of goods and services that all firms in an economy are willing and able to produce at various price levels. It's important to understand that several factors influence this supply. Production costs, such as wages and raw materials, play a big role. Then, the availability of resources like labor and capital also impacts how much can be produced. Technological advancements can improve efficiency and increase supply. Lastly, the expectations that firms hold about the future, like anticipated demand or costs, can affect their willingness to produce more or less. All these elements together shape the overall supply side of the economy. Here we have the short-run aggregate supply curve, which shows the relationship between the price level and the output, or real GDP, in the short term. As output increases from 80 to 170, we can see the price level rising from 1,000 to 2,800. This upward slope indicates that as the economy produces more goods and services, prices tend to increase. This happens because higher production often leads to increased costs for businesses, which then push prices up. Understanding this curve is essential because it helps explain how supply responds to changes in the overall price level in the short run, influencing inflation and economic growth. Here we have the long-run aggregate supply model illustrated along with the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curves. On the horizontal axis, we measure real GDP or output, and on the vertical axis, we have the price level. Notice that the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, reflecting the idea that in the long run, output is determined by factors like technology and resources, not by the price level. Meanwhile, the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, showing that higher price levels correspond to lower demand for goods and services. The short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward, indicating that as prices rise, producers are willing to supply more in the short term. What's important here is how these curves intersect, helping us understand equilibrium price levels and output in both the short run and long run. This framework is crucial for analyzing economic fluctuations and policy impacts. Let's look at what causes short-run aggregate supply to shift. First, under favorable supply conditions, things like increased productivity and lower input costs allow firms to produce more at every price level. This can happen with wage restraint, improved technology, or stable energy prices, all of which help boost production capacity. On the other hand, adverse supply conditions work against this. Rising input prices, supply disruptions, and higher energy costs reduce firms' ability to produce at any given price level. Additionally, if firms expect future shortages, they may contract supply in anticipation, further limiting production. These factors together play a crucial role in how short-run aggregate supply fluctuates in the economy. Here we have a line chart showing the relationship between aggregate demand and aggregate supply across different levels of real output or GDP. On the horizontal axis, we measure real output, starting from 0.5 trillion up to 5 trillion. On the vertical axis, we track the price level. As you can see, the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, meaning that as the price level falls, the quantity of goods and services demanded increases. For example, at a price level of 100, demand is only at 0.5 trillion, but it rises as prices drop. Conversely, the aggregate supply curve slopes upward, reflecting that as the price level rises, producers are willing to supply more. At a low price level of 10, supply is only 0.5 trillion, but it increases steadily with price. The key point is the intersection of these two lines, which represents the equilibrium price level and real output in the economy. This balance point indicates where the quantity of goods and services demanded equals the quantity supplied, signaling economic equilibrium. Understanding this interaction helps explain how changes in price levels affect overall economic activity. Here we have the concept of the recessionary gap, which occurs when the economy is not performing at its full potential. First, output is below potential. This means the equilibrium output is less than what the economy is capable of producing because demand is weak. As a result, many resources, including labor and capital, are not fully utilized. This leads us to the second key point, labor underuse. High unemployment happens because there isn't enough demand for goods and services to keep everyone employed. During this time, productive capacity goes unused, which highlights the inefficiency caused by the recessionary gap. Understanding this helps explain the challenges economies face during downturns. Here we see a line graph illustrating the relationship between equilibrium output and potential output over a 7-year period. The equilibrium output represents the actual level of economic output at each point in time, while the potential output reflects the economy's capacity to produce without generating inflationary pressure. Notice that, over the years, both outputs increase, but equilibrium output consistently rises faster than potential output. This divergence indicates an inflationary gap where demand is outstripping supply, leading to upward pressure on prices. Understanding this gap is crucial because it signals when the economy might overheat, prompting policymakers to consider measures to stabilize growth and control inflation. Here, we're looking at what happens during a negative demand shock. First, when aggregate demand falls, it means that consumer confidence, investment, or government spending has decreased. This decline causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. As a result, output decreases, which puts pressure on employment since businesses produce less and may reduce their workforce. Additionally, this lower demand puts downward pressure on prices, meaning we could see deflation or slower inflation during such periods. Overall, a negative demand shock leads to weaker economic activity and can have significant impacts across multiple sectors. Here we see the effects of a negative supply shock on the short-run aggregate supply curve. The chart plots price level against real GDP output. Initially, the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward, reflecting that higher output levels correlate with higher price levels. After the shock, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts leftward and flattens at a price level of 60 for output beyond 60 units. This indicates that the supply shock has reduced the economy's capacity to produce at lower prices, leading to higher price levels across a wide range of outputs. Meanwhile, the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, consistent with the typical inverse relationship between price level and output demanded. The key takeaway is that a negative supply shock drives up prices and reduces output, illustrating how disruption on the supply side can lead to inflationary pressures and lower economic growth in the short run. Here we're focusing on the Great Depression through the lens of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The key idea is that during the Great Depression, there was a drastic leftward shift in aggregate demand. This happened because financial distress was widespread. People and businesses lost confidence, cut back on spending, and banks failed. As a result, total spending in the economy plummeted. The consequence of this collapse in demand was severe, and unemployment soared. Understanding this shift helps explain why the economy shrank so dramatically during this period. Here we see a line chart illustrating the shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply during the Great Depression. The x-axis represents output, or GDP, while the y-axis shows the price level. The initial aggregate demand curve starts higher, indicating greater demand at each price level before the Depression. During the Depression, aggregate demand significantly decreases, shifting the curve downward and to the left, reflecting reduced consumer spending and investment. Meanwhile, the aggregate supply curve remains relatively steady, indicating that production capacity didn't shift as dramatically. This combination of falling demand and relatively unchanged supply led to a lower output and price level, capturing the economic contraction experienced in this period. The key takeaway is how the sharp decline in demand drove the economic downturn, which is central to understanding the dynamics of the Great Depression in this model. Here we see the tremendous impact of World War II on production and employment. The headline, Wartime Mobilization, captures the essence of this period. Government spending increased dramatically as massive public procurement efforts pushed industries to expand rapidly. This surge in fiscal demand was crucial in reviving output and creating jobs across many sectors. The image on the right shows a busy wartime industrial production line, illustrating how workers were mobilized to meet the urgent needs of the military. This period highlighted the powerful role of government intervention in driving economic activity. Here we focus on the post-war expansion and the stable growth that followed. After the war, there was a strong demand for goods and services, which, combined with rising productivity, created an environment ripe for economic resurgence. This growth wasn't just about numbers. It translated into real benefits like higher employment rates and improved living standards. People found more job opportunities, and industries thrived, laying the foundation for a prosperous period. The image on the right, showing industrial work and welding, perfectly captures the spirit of this dynamic, productive era. Here we're looking at the stagflation of the 1970s, a period marked by an unusual and difficult economic situation. During this decade, the economy faced weak growth, meaning that the overall production and expansion were very slow. At the same time, inflation was rising, which means prices for goods and services were increasing. This was largely driven by adverse supply shocks, like oil price spikes, which made it more expensive to produce and transport goods. What made this so challenging was that it contradicted traditional economic theories, which typically assumed that inflation and growth moved in opposite directions. Instead, the 1970s showed us that you could have both high inflation and stagnant growth occurring together, posing significant policy dilemmas. Here we're looking at the effects of an oil shock through the lens of aggregate demand and supply. First, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left because higher energy costs make production more expensive. This means there's less supply of goods and services available overall. Secondly, we see the broader macroeconomic impact. As production costs go up, output declines. Consequently, prices rise, which reflects inflationary pressures throughout the economy. The image of the old rusting oil pump jack helps visualize how disruptions or constraints in oil supply can lead to these significant economic shifts. The 2008 financial crisis had a profound impact on the economy, primarily through a collapse in lending and spending. Lending tightened dramatically as financial institutions became wary, which in turn eroded household wealth and hindered business investments. This ripple effect caused consumer and business confidence to plummet. With credit harder to access and confidence low, overall demand in the economy dropped sharply, deepening the economic downturn. This combination of factors is what led to the severe contraction we experienced during that period. Here we have a line chart illustrating the aggregate demand and supply curves before and after the 2008 financial crisis. The horizontal axis represents real GDP or output, while the vertical axis shows the price level. Notice how the aggregate demand curve shifts significantly to the left after 2008, indicating a decrease in demand at every price level. This reflects the sharp contraction in economic activity during and following the crisis. The short-run aggregate supply curve remains relatively stable, but the overall effect is a lower equilibrium output and price level in the post-crisis period. This visualization helps us understand the impact the financial crisis had on overall economic demand and how it disrupted the balance between demand and supply. The COVID-19 recession was a unique economic event caused by the global pandemic. It led to widespread disruptions on both the demand and supply sides of the economy. Shutdowns and uncertainty created significant challenges, while broken supply chains added another layer of complexity. What makes this recession particularly unusual is how unevenly it affected different sectors. Some industries faced severe impacts due to their direct exposure to these disruptions, while others were less affected or impacted in different ways. This broad shock reshaped many aspects of the global economy in ways we're still analyzing today. Here we see how the COVID-19 pandemic affected the economy through shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, alongside changes in the unemployment rate. Before the pandemic, both demand and supply were at a healthy level as 100, with unemployment at just 4%. As the pandemic hit, aggregate demand dropped significantly, reflecting reduced consumer spending and investment, while supply also declined due to disruptions, though less sharply. This led to a rise in unemployment, peaking during the strict lockdowns when demand and supply hit their lowest points, and unemployment soared to 14%. With the initial recovery phase, demand began to rebound faster than supply, which leveled out at similar points, causing unemployment to start falling but still remaining elevated. By the late recovery and post-pandemic periods, demand even surpassed pre-pandemic levels, suggesting strong consumer activity. While supply was catching up, unemployment gradually returned closer to normal levels. This chart clearly illustrates the dynamic interplay between demand, supply, and employment throughout the stages of the pandemic shock. Monetary policy is essentially how central banks steer the economy by adjusting interest rates and controlling the money supply. This helps influence key economic factors such as consumer spending, inflation levels, and employment rates. The primary purpose of monetary policy is to stabilize the economy, making sure it grows steadily without overheating or slipping into recession. By managing these levers effectively, central banks play a crucial role in maintaining economic balance and confidence. The image here of the central bank building emphasizes the institution responsible for these important decisions. Here we're looking at how monetary policy actually works its way through the economy. When policymakers adjust interest rates or other monetary tools, it directly influences borrowing costs. This affects how much businesses invest and how much consumers spend. Lower borrowing costs typically encourage more investment and consumption, while higher costs tend to slow them down. These changes also impact exchange rates, which in turn can affect exports and imports, influencing the overall demand within the country. Ultimately, these shifts in spending and investment combine to shape the broader economic activity. So the key takeaway is that monetary policy doesn't just stay in the banking system. It moves through various channels, affecting wallets and decisions across the whole economy. This interconnected movement is what drives growth or cools down inflation pressures. Here we see the impact of expansionary monetary policy on aggregate demand and supply. The chart illustrates three key curves: the initial aggregate demand, the aggregate supply, and the shifted aggregate demand after monetary policy intervention. On the horizontal axis, we have real output, and on the vertical axis, the price level. Notice how the initial aggregate demand curve starts higher, but shifts to the right as the policy takes effect, indicating an increase in total demand in the economy. This shift suggests that expansionary monetary policy, such as lowering interest rates or increasing money supply, encourages more spending and investment. Meanwhile, the aggregate supply curve remains unchanged, showing the economy's productive capacity. The crucial takeaway is that this rightward shift in aggregate demand can lead to higher output and potentially higher price levels in the short run. This helps stimulate economic growth, especially during periods of recession or low activity. Understanding this dynamic is vital for grasping how monetary policy tools influence overall economic performance. Here we see how contractionary monetary policy impacts aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The original aggregate demand curve, labeled AD1, shifts leftward to AD2 after the policy is implemented. This shift reflects a decrease in overall demand within the economy, usually due to higher interest rates or reduced money supply. As a result, for each level of real GDP, the price level drops from AD1 to AD2. Meanwhile, the aggregate supply curve remains unchanged, indicating that supply-side factors haven't been directly affected by the policy. Overall, this movement tends to lower the price level but also reduces real GDP, illustrating the trade-off policymakers face when using contractionary measures to control inflation. Fiscal policy is a powerful tool governments use to guide the economy by adjusting spending and taxation. Essentially, it works by influencing aggregate demand, the total demand for goods and services in the economy. When there's a recession, for example, increased government spending or tax cuts can stimulate demand, helping to boost economic activity and support employment. On the other hand, during times of high inflation, fiscal policy can pull back demand by reducing spending or increasing taxes, which helps to keep price pressures in check. So, fiscal policy plays a crucial role not only in smoothing out economic cycles, but also in promoting stable growth and job creation. Here we see how fiscal multipliers vary depending on the size of the fiscal stimulus or tax change, and how different economic conditions amplify these effects. The chart illustrates three scenarios: a high marginal propensity to consume, a slack economy, and tight financial conditions. Starting from the left, when the fiscal stimulus is negative, meaning a contraction, the overall economic output decreases as expected, but the magnitude depends on the context. For instance, with a high marginal propensity to consume, output contracts less sharply compared to tight financial conditions. As we move to positive fiscal stimulus, or expansion, the amplification effects become more pronounced. Notice that in a high marginal propensity to consume environment, a 30% expansion can nearly double the economic output, reaching a multiplier of 2. This indicates that consumers quickly spend additional income, boosting demand and growth. Similarly, a slack economy, which means underutilized resources and labor, shows a strong response, though slightly less than the high consumption case, peaking at 1.8. On the other hand, tight financial conditions dampen the multiplier effect, with output growing only marginally, even at larger stimulus sizes. This chart highlights the crucial role of economic context in determining how effective fiscal policies are at stimulating growth. Understanding these amplification effects helps in designing targeted fiscal interventions that maximize economic output during different phases of the economic cycle. Here we see the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model illustrating a recessionary gap and the impact of expansionary fiscal policy. The vertical axis represents the aggregate price level, while the horizontal axis shows the output level. The aggregate supply curve remains constant at 100 across all output levels, indicating a fixed potential output. Initially, aggregate demand is lower, shown by AD1, which results in output levels below potential, signaling a recessionary gap. After implementing expansionary fiscal policy, aggregate demand shifts to AD2, moving closer to and eventually reaching the potential output level at Y3. This shift not only increases output, but also raises the aggregate price level, which is a common effect of stimulating the economy. Essentially, the policy helps close the recessionary gap by boosting demand, driving the economy toward full employment and higher production levels. Here, we can see the impact of contractionary fiscal policy over an 8-year period, focusing on two key metrics: aggregate demand and public debt levels. Starting at a baseline index of 100 in the first year, both measures gradually decline over time. Aggregate demand decreases more steeply, dropping to 76 by year 8, indicating significant reduction in overall economic activity as fiscal tightening takes effect. Meanwhile, public debt also slowly declines, but at a much more gradual pace, reaching 91 in year 8. This illustrates that while contractionary policies effectively reduce demand in the short term, the reduction in public debt happens more gradually, highlighting the trade-offs policymakers face between controlling inflation and managing debt levels. Here we have a powerful insight from John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who fundamentally shaped modern economic thought through Keynesian economics. He's well known for emphasizing the importance of managing demand to maintain employment levels in the economy. Keynes believed deeply in the influence of ideas, stating that both correct and incorrect economic and political theories hold immense power over the world. According to him, Here we're looking at the key debate surrounding Keynesian policy tools. On one side, we have the support for intervention. This perspective argues for using active fiscal policy to stabilize the economy, especially during downturns. The focus is on countercyclical spending, which means increasing government expenditures when demand is low to help boost growth and smooth out economic fluctuations. On the other hand, there are significant concerns about intervention. Critics point out the risks involved with the timing of these policies, such as delays that might worsen deficits and contribute to inflation. They also highlight the limitations of what the government can realistically achieve and warn about unintended consequences that may arise from such intervention. Understanding both sides helps us appreciate the complexity of applying Keynesian tools in real-world economic policy. To wrap up, the ADAS model really helps us understand how private spending and government policies work together to influence the overall economy. Looking back at history, we see clear examples of how important it is for monetary and fiscal policies to step in and manage demand, especially during tough times. Keynesian economics teaches us that active policy measures are crucial for stabilizing the economy when private demand isn't enough to keep things running smoothly. This framework gives us valuable insights into how we can better navigate economic challenges and aim for stability.